Thank you. I just want to begin by thanking you, Guilherme, for the invitation to come and speak, and to Lucas for helping us make it happen, and of course to Vilne also for helping us with translation. I appreciate the work that you have all put into this. And I'd also like to thank the Unisinos and the Instituto Humanitas for all of those participants for coming to have this conversation. And I really look forward to your thoughts and questions following the presentation. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to begin by inviting you to reflect for a moment on this. This is the edge of Solheimajökull, a glacier in southern Iceland. Here you see it melting away, one drop at a time, one slow drop at a time. So this is obviously a very small picture, but it is also one that offers us a much bigger picture of the climate crisis that is affecting all of us everywhere, even though it is affecting us in different ways and with different magnitudes of loss and suffering. So today, I'd like to speak with you about a project that I've been working on over the last several years with the eye to the next few years of research. So I'll be moving through this presentation in three parts. I begin in the Arctic region in the very, very north of our world with the question of melt. And here I go to the country of Iceland to look at the question of cryospheres and the loss of cryospheres. Then I move into a discussion of rising oceans, rising seas along the coast of the world, and how that dynamic can be understood at the nexus of anthropology and physical climate models produced by physical scientists. And at the end, I'll be turning to questions of reckoning. That is how we are contending and grappling and trying to understand these questions of large environmental change and how different publics and populations are feeling those effects quite differently. So across this work, I take into account several dimensions, namely that the climatological crisis requires understanding and action based on climate justice, that we cannot forget the importance of climate justice, and that we need to respond to interlocking forms of socio-environmental precarity. So that's where sociality and environment come together, but in a very precarious setting. And one of the ways that I've found useful for contending with that climatological and socio-environmental precarity is to think through something that Max Liboiron and their colleagues have called reconciliation science. And this has to do with connecting to local communities, to indigenous communities, to marginalized communities, and understanding the climate science based on their needs and their histories of dispossession. So here you see a screenshot of the page for the latest IPCC report that focuses specifically on the ocean and the cryosphere in a changing climate. And I will tell you that as someone who watches these reports come out in a regular fashion, there's rarely good news in these reports. That is, there's rarely a happy story being told in the IPCC reports. This latest overview of the scientific consensus confirms once again that the world's melting ice sheets and glaciers are the dominant source of sea level rise around the world. So we have a phenomenon in the oceans called oceanic thermal expansion. And that is where the water molecules become larger because they're heated. We also have the fact of ocean acidification, where carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are absorbed into the ocean system. But more than those, the oceans are being affected by the infusion of melting ice from glaciers and ice sheets. And in particular, the melt is coming from the Arctic region. So although the Antarctic is much larger in terms of its size and the amount of ice that it holds, we can see that it actually right now is producing less in terms of what it contributes to the rise of seas in the oceans. So we see that in Greenland, for example, in the Arctic, it lost 260 billion tons of ice per year. Antarctica, only 140, still a lot. From 2006 to 2015, we see that the global mean sea level rise has risen 2.5 times faster than during the entirety of the 20th century. So we know that sea levels are rising faster and farther than expected. And as the IPCC report shows, this phenomenon is actually accelerating and going faster as we move along. So the country of Iceland is experiencing this great melting at a really high rate and quite dramatically. About 10% of the island surface is covered in ice. Here you can see these patches of ice. The largest glacier in Europe is Vatnajökull, which is this big piece of white that you see at the southern part of the country. So you have a lot of ice on this country, and you also have people whose lives and landscapes have been quite conditioned, shaped, influenced by those cryospheres over the last 1,200 years that Icelanders have lived on the island of Iceland. So a conservative estimate now predicts that all of Iceland's remaining glaciers will actually be gone by the year 2170. I began to think about this kind of icy intimacy, this connection, this cohabitation with ice as a kind of cryo-human relationship where bodies of ice come to infuse and inflect the human worlds that occur in this place. And we found that they are very entangled with human settlements, so much so that ice becomes integral to the relationship. So in this land defined by ice that's now melting away, one question I begin to ask is, how does this precarity become manifest, both in the bodies of ice that are affected, as well as the human beings who are affected by that loss of ice? And this question of precarity, I borrow from the anthropologist Anna Singh, who talks about precarity as life without the promise of stability. That condition of not knowing exactly what will happen next and what sorts of steps we might take into the future. So this kind of intimacy with ice, again, I think of as a kind of cryo-human relationship, a relationship between the cryosphere, the ice of the world, and human beings who live near that ice, and the kinds of intimacies that occur through that. So let me take you to some stories of that cryo-human relationship and that icy intimacy. So when she was a young girl, Helga Oymundsdóttir was terrified by the sound of sea ice at night. She grew up in the little town of Ísafjörður, which actually means ice fjord, in the northwestern part of the island of Iceland, where impenetrable winters would often seal off the town from the rest of the country for much of the year. Helga, who's now in her late 40s, recalls hearing through her bedroom window as a child these floating islands of ice that would grate out this high-pitched moans in the harbor and these sounds of ice crashing into the harbor and coming across the seascape outside her window. This was a sound that many explorers in the Arctic called the Devil's Symphony. This was this discordant scrape and shriek of ice upon ice upon ice. So now, Helga says, those haunting night noises that so terrified her as a child have actually disappeared entirely. And as Helga said to me, these days I hardly ever hear that sound that so frightened me as a girl. And searching for a way to express that loss, she quietly offered that she does actually miss that sound now that it's gone. Helgi Björnsson is a man who knows quite a bit about ice. He is one of Iceland's preeminent glaciologists, And so I turned to him when I needed to learn more about the country's cryoforms and the science that tries to understand them. When I met him, Helgi explained that glaciers have long been described in terms that we would recognize as more common to human beings, or at least to living beings. So he explained to me that glaciers have toes, and glaciers have snouts, and glaciers have tongues. And he also said that this term ablation is a word borrowed from surgery, from the medical practice of surgery. And what it means in English is the loss of flesh, the cutting off of flesh. And so they borrowed this term in glaciology and used this term for the scientific description of melting glaciers and calving glaciers. Now, Helgi's work over the last decades has shown us that ablation is happening faster than he had predicted or imagined. And the mass balance required for glacial equilibrium is actually no longer there. This is Guðfinna Alþergisdóttir in the front here with the pencil in her hand. This is Helgi's younger protege, and she is certainly the kind of person that you would want to have next to you if you were on top of a glacier. Every summer, she takes a team of students out to Sólheimajökull, and they measure the loss of ice. So Guðfinna belongs to a new generation of scientists who are seeing accelerations everywhere. In the older climate models, she explained, glaciers were these white splotches or white dots on the graphs and the charts. But now they're changing so rapidly, so quickly, that they have become more central to the dynamics of climate modeling. And Guðfinna says that glaciology now, which comes from the discipline of geology, is actually becoming more like meteorology, the tracking of weather. And so she sees the connection between rapid changes in the cryosphere and these rapid changes that are occurring with our weather systems and how those are coming together in scientific models. She also said to me that the climate precarity that we are currently facing is the largest uncontrolled experiment in the history of the world. And she said, we'll see where it will lead. So on the far eastern edge of the highlands, I met with Hulda and Guðni, who are sheep farmers who have lived their entire lives at the foot of a glacial tongue called Fláajökull. As we sat around their little wooden dining table drinking coffee, I asked them about the glacier that lurks just around the corner, around the bend from their farm. And here you see what I call the cutting edge of Fláajökull. Like many of his neighbors, Guðni knows that glaciers can become quite monstrous, that they can topple houses and they can uproot barns as they crawl across the earth. They also threaten those below with glacial outburst floods, these massive rushing waters of ice the size of cars that come barreling down the valley very, very quickly. So both Hulda and Guðni remember stories of people and animals and buildings that were swept out to sea into the North Atlantic by glacial floods, lost to these frigid waters at the very north of the world. And here we see Guðni pointing toward his glacier, the one tucked behind his farm, and he agreed after much reflection that he can sometimes, only sometimes, find beauty in a glacier near his home. But he had to question this. However, he said he wanted a picture of himself with the glacier for posterity. So time and again in the stories that I heard as I spoke to people in Iceland, using the forum of cultural anthropology or ethnography to speak with people, I found again and again that glaciers had gone from being a threat to something that terrified people, something that was this massive force on the landscape, or the source of a glacial outburst flood, from being a source of threat to being a source of care, something in need of attention, something in need of nurturing. When I first spoke to the poet and filmmaker Andri Snær Magnusson, he put it this way: when my grandmother traveled across the glaciers, it was in the context of eternity. It was like the waves, the rocks, the sand, things that would change only over thousands of years. But now many of these same glaciers will vanish in the time between when someone is born today and when they become my grandmother's age. So Andre is able to capture this time scale between glaciers and human beings in very interesting and poetic ways. But of course, it is not just sheets of ice and glaciers or human beings that are being affected by these dynamics. In the summer of 2016, this polar bear was shot when she came ashore in Northwest Iceland. Polar bears are not native to Iceland. They drift over on sea ice or on icebergs, or they swim from Greenland as their own cryospheres dissolve. The shortest distance between Greenland and Iceland is 300 kilometers, but the distance that this bear had traveled was considerably longer, closer to 600 kilometers. And when the female bear's carcass was dissected, it showed that she was still lactating, meaning that she had been nursing her cubs until very, very recently. So it is national policy in Iceland to kill polar bears on site when they come ashore on the island. Still, the killing of the mother bear provoked very emotional responses across the country in the days that followed, especially on social media sites like Facebook. Reactions were divided along two general lines. First, that Icelanders must protect themselves and their livestock, and being that bears come ashore in remote parts of the island and are invariably hungry, it is up to local farmers to shoot them in order to ensure the safety of local residents. But the second opinion was that Icelanders ought to adopt a more humane response to these landings of polar bears, given that they will invariably increase and their acceleration of climate change will actually make their arrival more and more common. A spokesman for Polar World, which is a German group dedicated to the preservation of polar bears and other creatures in the Arctic, called the bear's death an avoidable tragedy, adding in full irony, "This is another great day for mankind." So lost ice and dead bears and these fading sounds and forever reimagined, as Andre's words show us, come together as fragments of the irrecuperable, those things which cannot be returned to possibility. And in these kinds of cryo-human encounters, we're caught between this elegy of mourning, this kind of repetition of mourning and loss, and worries that are tied to the future subjunctive form that might be. These impending conditions of collapsing possibility and signs of precarity. So one question is, how do we capture that sense of precarity in a way that it can become functional and translated to other populations and for better understanding? And one of the ways I've found to do this is through the modality of public anthropology, which aims to illuminate the larger social issues of our times, encourage broad public conversations about them, and to try and aim for social change. Public anthropology is also interested in responding to specific conditions and also with collaborating with communities to do engaged research, and also engaging with the media, mass media, social media, the media, to reach publics in ways that academic programs often aren't able to do. These academic papers that we write often don't get the kind of attention or readership that we might hope. So in 2018, I collaborated with an Icelandic filmmaker and my research partner, Dominic Boyer, to create this short little documentary. It's called Not Okay, or Not Ok, a little movie about a small glacier at the end of the world. And this film came out of a small discovery that I made in 2016 while talking to Icelanders about the loss of ice in their country. And that was a question of this little place called Ok. Of course, it looks like the English word for okay, but you'll see that Ok is actually not okay. This is a picture of Ok Mountain, covered in snow and ice, and you can see It's an extinct volcano. You can see the crater of the volcano here, these rocks coming up. And over in the distance, there are other glaciers right near Ok. So I was looking for glaciers in Iceland and to talk to the people who knew them or would be affected by them. And Ok was right there on the map. You could see Ok on all the human maps, but there was almost nothing written about this little tiny glacier. And then I came across this little tiny report. It was about 73 words in total. And it said, according to photographs and other data, one of Iceland's smallest and yet most famous glaciers, Ok, is about to forever disappear. Glaciologists had determined that it was no longer moving, and it said, as of now, Ok no longer qualifies as a glacier. So essentially, Ok was the first Icelandic glacier to be lost to climate change. We could say that it was the first named glacier in Iceland to be killed by climate change. And yet there was very little attention. There was almost no news about it anywhere. And when I spoke to my Icelandic colleagues and friends, they also had little awareness about the loss of this little glacier, which, although it was small, was also quite well known across the country. Ok is the name for Ok Glacier. Jökull means glacier in Icelandic. And Ok had been with us for about 800 years. It first appeared on a very famous glacier map from 1792 that detailed the Langjökull glacial family, the second largest ice cap in Iceland. And here on the right, you see the top of Ok Glacier in this hand-painted map. And we also saw aerial photographs like this one from 1978, where you see the glacier stretching across the northern part of Ok Mountain. And in that photograph, the crater of the mountain, which we saw earlier, is quite visible, but it's making this very weird, misshapen, almost half smiling face with its eye partly closed. So it looks as though the mountain is winking or maybe blinking at us in a kind of sinister way, I would say. This is a picture from a NASA satellite. This is how Ok looked in 1986. On the left, you can see the glacier at the top here above the crater. And this is how Ok looked in 2019. As you can see, the glacier is entirely gone. There's maybe a little tiny bit of remnant ice left from the glacier that's now almost entirely disappeared. So from Hallgrímur Amundsen, I learned actually that Ok Mountain had its own special talents and skills. Hallgrímur is a linguist who works at the government institute dedicated to the research and preservation of place names. And he told me rather proudly that Ok Mountain can actually write its own name. I was surprised by this, but he added for emphasis, that is pretty special for a mountain, being able to write its own name. But he had to explain this a bit further. So he said, when we look at the top of Ok Mountain from the aerial view from the sky, we can see that the assemblage of ice and snow and stone make kind of an O with a C in the middle. And in ancient Icelandic, in medieval Icelandic, that is how Ok would have been spelled, O-C, rather than O-K. And so Hallgrímur also wanted to point out to me that it in fact looks very much like the copyright symbol. In other words, Ok Mountain is quite an original. So Oddur Sigurdsson is the glaciologist who had first recorded Ok's passing back in 2014. And when I asked Oddur how he felt about the loss of Ok, this little glacier that he had been watching over for many years, he took a long pause and he looked back into my question. Over time, he said he had developed a certain fondness for Ok, the glacier with the funny name, and now it was gone. It is a loss, he said. It is like losing an old friend. So glaciers, as many of you know, are really all about time. They have these fern lines that are like tree rings that show their age, and they are a record of wars and eruptions, weather and atomic blasts. The renowned glaciologist Richard Alley described glaciers as time machines because they hold on to the past and they are a frozen document of climates and creatures. But now as they expire, glaciers tell us about a future as well. So they're not just recording history, they're actually in a subjunctive mode predicting a certain future. So in part, what was so troubling about the loss of Okiokot was the relative silence around it, the collective shrug that the world seemed to have given to the loss of this little glacier. And anthropologists know that recognizing a death does commit us to recognizing a different future and a new future. And that mourning rituals are actually universally practiced by us humans. In every known culture everywhere throughout time, we have practices of mourning and ritual, funerals and loss. So that kind of recognition was the spirit behind our memorial ceremony for Okiokot. In 2019, in August, with Oder and Gufina artists and youth climate activists, we held a kind of a funeral of sorts on top of the mountain. And the memorial on top of Ok Mountain was the first in the world to memorialize a glacier fall into climate change. It was the first funeral for a glacier in the world. And we asked Andre Sneyer Magnuson, the poet, to write the words for the plaque that we placed on top of Ok Mountain, which you see here. First in Icelandic at the top and then in English. And it reads, "A letter to the future. Ok is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done, but only you know if we did it." So Okiokot's passing had originally gone virtually unnoticed, almost no recognition in the Icelandic press and the English press. But in its memorializing, in having this funeral and recognizing its passing, this little glacier became the subject of quite a bit of media attention. So the story of Okiokot's memorial became, quite surprisingly to us, headline news all over the world in the summer of 2019, where we began to see headlines in many, many, many different languages. And on the front pages of major media outlets like CNN or the New York Times, we saw it appear in the Washington Post, and Der Spiegel, and Le Monde, and The Guardian, and even the magazine Popular Mechanics, which is a car magazine, an automobile magazine, and Elle magazine, which is a fashion magazine, gave it full features, recognizing that this event had an important story to tell us. But maybe more than all this media recognition was a small tweet that someone forwarded to me that came out based on a piece that The Economist does. And this person says, "As a longtime reader of The Economist, I have often been moved by the obituary column, but I was astonished to find myself weeping over the death of the Okiokot Glacier in Iceland, a response triggered as much by the beauty of the writing and as the poignancy of the event. Later that day, I called my broker and divested all of my fossil fuel holdings." And so this is just one person taking funds out of fossil fuel holdings and changing the conversation in a small way. But I think it was striking in terms of the kinds of effects that we can see when we do public work that gets recognized and that can actually have a kind of afterlife of its own. So this is a picture that I took in the summer of 2021. As you see, the plaque has gotten weathered over the last 2 years. And I think you also see at the bottom of the picture here on the right that someone had left flowers. So we found those flowers there. So people are going up to the top of the mountain, which is about a 3-hour hike to get there, to leave flowers for Okiokot now. There are also another funeral that same summer, another funeral for a glacier in the Swiss Alps. And we've also seen memorial plaques using much of the same language in the Pyrenees and in Mexico and in Oregon. So these glacier funerals, these glacier plaques and memorials are proliferating and reverberating around the world. And so this is one of the ways that public anthropology can make a small difference. It involves collaborative work with communities, and it involves public messaging about the critical issues that we face. And it also means feeling the climate crisis that is befalling us all. It involves taking seriously the socio-natural relationships that comprise our collective worlds. So let me turn you now to the next dimension of this project. So we know that the loss of ice in the Arctic and elsewhere is becoming a bloated ocean around the world. That Iceland's melt means that someplace else far away is experiencing sea level rise. So throughout the time that I've been doing the work on melt in Iceland, I've also been thinking about the dynamics at the other end of that process. And namely, that is how melt becomes rise. So we know that dead cryospheres are actually resurrected as emergent hydrospheres, and they come to play out in very different ways. But my question was, what if we could actually follow the water? What if we could follow the water from melting glaciers to where it becomes sea level rise in coastal cities and in coasts around the world? What would it mean to follow ice and water as a vehicle of connection and hydrological connectivity? So the IPCC report tells us that in the year 2100, we will have sea level rise of between 18 and 59 centimeters. Many experts believe it would be much higher than that, closer to 1 meter of sea level rise around the world at the end of the century. That means that in 80 years, about 200 million people who now live on land that is not submerged by water will at that time be inundated and covered in seawater. So building from the physical connectivity of water, in this project, Melt Rise, I'm working collaboratively with communities to understand how they are contending with a changing hydrosphere by comparing adaptation responses. And I'm proposing that these evolving hydrological cycles are in fact creating new kinds of connection, new kinds of social connectivity that's occurring in the material form of water. That is, that we are being connected to each other through water and through the world ocean in new ways. So let me give you a very quick picture of the science behind this project. So up until very, very recently, it was impossible to follow the water of a melting glacier to sea level rise anywhere. That science was not available. Then in the year 2018, a group of physicists at NASA came up with a model, which they put online, that shows us how the Earth's cryosphere is impacting sea level rise around the world. And what this tool can show us, it's called the gradient fingerprint map, is that where freshwater melt is becoming sea level rise in 293 of the world's coastal cities. So currently, this is the only tool, this is the only scientific model available that can show us where the melt of Greenland is becoming sea level rise in New York City, or where the melt in Alaska is becoming sea level rise in Rio de Janeiro. And so here at the top, you can go and you can click down on all these different cities and see exactly where melting ice is becoming sea level rise in a coastal city. So when I spoke to the lead physicist who developed this model, he said to me, melt ice anywhere in the world and we can show you the shape that the ocean will adopt and how that becomes sea level rise. So what the model shows us is that these coastal cities like Miami here that are suffering sea level inundation can be tied directly. There's a direct line between sea level rise and ice loss. And the gradient fingerprint map, this model, also renders local sea level changes as they relate to all the world's ice systems. So we can look at ice in Antarctica, we can look at the loss of ice in the Alps, we can look at the Canadian Arctic, to the Andes, or from Svalbard to the Himalayas. In all these glacial basins, we can see where that is then becoming sea level rise. So the scientists who created this tool and put it online were very interested for coastal planners and others to use it as a tool for policy. And they were interested in it having social applications, not just an interesting quirk of science, but to have policymakers and others think through the applications and make use of the data that's made available through this climate model. And I'm really interested in understanding, as I said, the connections and the relationships that might be established and created through these connections between the loss of ice and the rising seas. So I'll ask you to think for a moment. If we look at Iceland, and here you can see Iceland is just to the right of Greenland here, and you can see it's got this red patch, that's the melting ice on Iceland. Where you think the melt of Iceland is going? There's one city in the world that is being affected more by Icelandic melt, the loss of ice in Iceland, than any other city in the world. And I think you'll find it surprising, because it is not London or Galveston or Jakarta or Miami. It's actually Cape Town, South Africa. So Cape Town, South Africa is the city in the world most affected by the loss of ice in Iceland. And the city in the United States most affected by the loss of Greenlandic ice is actually Honolulu, Hawaii. And so in this project, what I'm interested in doing is comparing adaptation practices across all of these 4 sites. And I'll be looking at the policies that are being enacted, the priorities within communities, as well as governmental agencies. And what this involves is understanding the connectivity of water and the shared relationships. So if we look at Iceland, ice and how it becomes water in Cape Town, we can do a comparison between melt and rise and across and between these different field sites. So the way that I'm thinking about this project, the kind of conceptual framework that I am proposing, I'm calling hydrological globalization. And that is a different kind of globalization that we saw through the globalization of trade at the end of the Cold War, where we saw a dissemination of media and finance, trade across human communities, migration and movement. These are all important activities of globalization in a traditional sense. But here I think we see something different. Here I think we see a kind of globalization that's specifically created by the Anthropocene, a kind of globalization that's being specifically accelerated by the human impact upon cryospheres and hydrospheres. And so that's how I began to think of it as hydrological globalization, not the common globalization between human communities, but one that connects those communities through the material form of water. So with hydrological globalization, we find these connections not primarily through these links of trade, migration, finance, media, but through these physical relationships that happen when our hydrosphere, our greater hydrosphere, becomes reshaped, as Eric put it, this reshaping of the ocean, and then how we respond to that. So my proposition is that from the time of neoliberal globalization, which we saw at the end of the 1980s and early 1990s, and then proliferated from that, we now see something that's more like Anthropocenic globalization that also includes neoliberal forms, but that takes on this extra form of a material response. So that the Anthropocene is a new era of global impacts and responses. So very quickly, the way I think of hydrological globalization is a balance between deterritorialization, when we think of Deleuze and Guattari, a kind of the land-based metaphor, to hydrological globalization, which is this water-based physicality, from detachment and hyperspaces that was so important to the postmodern turn and to early discussions of globalization, to attachment through hyper-objects, as Timothy Morton thinks of them, and these relationships like the world ocean, and then from scapes and flows, as Arjuna Padarai put them, that were grounded in human movement and the exchange of media and goods and ideologies, to the very physical consequences of Earth systems as they're transformed and as they come to impact our socio-cultural futures. So the Anthropocene is changing the processes of globalization. It is reshaping them and showing us clear points of erosion in our prior theoretical models. Here, the focus is on interconnectivity, and indigenous philosophy and feminist science studies have been very important for thinking through these processes and these questions of attention and care. So in the work that I've shared with you today, I really tried to highlight the potential of these physical processes to foretell, to predict in some ways, social futures. And I also hope to have underscored the importance of public anthropological work that has the ability to not only engage with local communities, but to speak to wider global audiences through media forms. And in order to speak to those global and wider audiences, I'm convinced that as academics, social scientists, and humanists, we need to work directly with artists and writers and other makers. And this is a really important direction to take, not only for aesthetic reasons, but because art helps us to tell collectively a more profoundly impactful and politically efficacious story. Because from my point of view, these arts of translation are important because science has not exactly failed to convey the magnitude and consequences of the climate crisis, but it hasn't really succeeded in telling the stories that we collectively, I think, need to hear. So, Guilherme, can I take another 5 minutes? Is it okay, or should I?
Claro.
Yes.
Fique à vontade.
Okay, great. All right, I just have a couple more pieces I wanted to show you because these next 3 slides are from the photographer Tina Freeman. She's an American photographer, and what she does is she juxtaposes the decomposition of Greenlandic ice. Here you see on the left, this is Greenland, with these ruined ecosystems in the Gulf of Mexico and places like Louisiana and the Gulf Coast of Texas. And she calls these areas rotten swamps that have spoiled and been destroyed. So I think in the work of someone like Tina Freeman, in this juxtaposition, we can see that we don't need a tool from NASA. We don't need a climate model or a group of physicists showing us the connection between lost ice and rising seas, or lost ice and ruined ecosystems. We can actually see this very empirically through artwork like Tina Freeman is creating. But I also think that, here's another one of hers. They're very beautiful pieces of artwork. And also, we don't necessarily need visual representations either. So I want to close here with a piece by Kathy Jetnio-Kijiner, who is a poet from the Marshall Islands. This is her in white. She lives in that part of the world known as the Pacific, right near the planet's equator. And standing next to her is Aka Niviana, who is also a poet. She's an Inuk woman from Greenland. And both of them have also been following the water. So in late 2018, Jetnio-Kijiner went from her home island, where the water continues to encroach, and she traveled to the world's largest island, which is Greenland, and she met Niviana atop a glacier there. It was this pockmarked body of ice on the very remote edge of Greenland's southern ice sheet. So one woman was called the sister of ice and snow, and the other was called the sister of ocean and sand. And atop that glacier, they exchanged some shells and stones, and they recited a poem that they had written together. They called the poem Rise. And I will just read a couple of stanzas here. So they write, with these shells, I bring a story of long ago. Two sisters frozen in time on the island of Ujjayi. One magically turned into stone, the other who chose that life to be rooted by her sister's side. To this day, the two sisters can be seen by the edge of the reef, a lesson in permanence. Sister of ocean and sand, can you see our glaciers groaning with the weight of the world's heat? I wait for you here on the land of my ancestors, heart heavy with a thirst for solutions as I watch this land change, while the world remains silent. From one island to another, I ask for solutions. From one island to another, I ask for your problems. Let me show you the tide that comes for us faster than we'd like to admit. None of us is immune, and each and every one of us has to decide if we will rise. So as earthly conditions are being reshaped in a world that is shedding its cryosphere and morphing its bodies of water, we too are undergoing a reshaping and a reformation of possibility or of peril, precarity, and others. So like the poets, I also close with the question of how it is that we might begin to collectively rise toward a more buoyant future for all of us. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, professora Cymene. Tenho certeza que foi uma apresentação muito importante, trouxe elementos muito importantes para a discussão do antropoceno, esse grande objeto de estudo, e também reflexões muito profundas a partir de elementos naturais, mas que estão remodelando a nossa condição como humanos, como espécie, como sociedade. Bom, antes, nós temos já algumas perguntas, porque, de fato, a apresentação teve elementos muito importantes, mas antes eu vou passar alguns recados para quem está nos assistindo, e nós lembramos que esse agora é um momento de interação com a professora, então as perguntas, manifestações, dúvidas, podem ser encaminhadas via chat, tanto do Zoom, para quem está acompanhando pelo Zoom, quanto do YouTube, Facebook, não só no nosso Facebook, mas também do CEPAT e Twitter. E também recordamos que quem deseja registrar presença ou se matricular nessa atividade, para receber o certificado, precisa preencher o formulário disponível no chat. E também, se vocês gostaram dessa conferência, não deixe de curtir, comentar, compartilhar, e caso tenham alguma dificuldade, envie também as dúvidas pelo chat, pois temos pessoas para ajudar você. Bom, vamos então para a primeira pergunta. Aqui no chat eu vou só abrir aqui para lê-la. Bom, o antropoceno, então, esse grande objeto de estudo, ele inclinará nossos estudos para uma espécie de determinismo geográfico, abandonado pelos geógrafos ao longo do século XX. Os fatores não humanos passarão a explicar cada vez mais a nossa condição humana, como as humanidades se prepararão para este desafio? Fica a primeira pergunta, professora.
Well, I'm glad. Yes, I am glad to hear that we are beginning with the largest question imaginable, which is, how does humanity prepare for these challenges? I think there are many approaches, and my answer to the last part of the question is that we need to have many approaches. One thing that we've tried collectively as a global political community are policy measures through the science of looking to the scientists who work in the natural sciences, implementing protocols like Kyoto and the Paris Agreement, and all of the international agreements that we have. Some of these have been somewhat successful, but none of them have been as successful as they must be, as they need to be. So part of me is very suspicious of the power of politics to bring us through this crisis. And we were speaking right before the presentation about electoral politics and the process of politicians changing office very regularly in our world, and how this can be a challenge for implementing change. So this is not an argument against the democratic process. It's just an understanding of how challenging the politics have been. So this is why I think it is very, very important to engage artists and the humanities and other media forms as a way of encouraging people to respond and to care. One of the things that I've found in the work in Iceland is that there are sometimes surprising ways in which people come to care about a particular phenomenon, like climate change. So I shared the story of the bear, the mother bear, right? Very important, I think, that she was a mother bear. It affected people in a way that was surprising. And yet, these little events can sometimes change people's minds in ways that are fundamental and critically important. Or the example of the woman who read the obituary in The Economist and then divested from the fossil fuel economy. I think we can make these incremental moves, these small moves towards change and transformation. It needs to be collective. It needs to be with an aspiration to create a better and different world. And you started with this question of geographical determinism, which I think is interesting because so much of the world, all of the world now, is really defined by maps. We have a cartographic logic, we could say, that determines where we can go in the world, how we identify in the world, what's possible in the world. But of course, these maps are fictions, right? They're fictions that are created by human beings, usually human beings in power, to make decisions about literally lines in the sand, or lines that create borders and divisions between states. They're not only fictions, but they're fairly recent fictions. And we know that ecosystems and polar bears cross over these lines all the time. And so I think in response to the other part of your question about the non-human, we can look to these non-human collaborators if we can begin to see them as collaborators. And I know in the humanities and social sciences, we are seeing the non-human as more and more of a collaborative process and subject, that we can begin to create different modalities of sensing the Anthropocene, of responding to the Anthropocene, and of understanding that geographical determinism is a farce and a fiction. And again, not that I want to give up entirely on the politics of climate, because I think we need that backstop, but I think we also need to think of more creative forms, even when it's coming out of little tiny events, little tiny phenomenon that we can recognize. So one of the things I've learned from the story of Åkjokot is that the little stories matter, and that we need to pay attention to the little stories, because so much of climate change media, so much of climate change discussion and reporting is about these really grand effects. And it's very overwhelming for people. I think it's very hard for people to fully understand the science, and honestly, they don't need to. But that part of it's overwhelming. And then the other part of it that's overwhelming is the scale and the size. And so I think tuning into these small stories, these little imprints that happen, can make a big difference.
Muito interessante, professora. Bom, abrindo mais elementos para a discussão, e eu acho que eles se conectam com as próximas perguntas. A próxima, por exemplo, fala que, através da sua exposição, nós podemos dizer que o derretimento da criosfera está causando e causará impacto nas paisagens, impacto nas culturas costeiras e alpestres, aceleração e perda da história, redistribuição populacional, em alguns casos, com o aumento do nível do mar, precariedade e instabilidade. E a pergunta vem, as perguntas que surgem a partir dessas inquietações. Quais os valores que estão sendo cultivados pelas gerações que estão sendo afetadas por esse rastro do antropoceno? E o que estas novas relações sociais e também naturais nos ensinam sobre o nosso futuro?
That's a great question. So I think it's very interesting to think about generation Anthropocene, that there is a generation of human beings, and for that matter, non-human beings, that are being born, that are being created, and that are being shaped by these conditions of the Anthropocene. So on the one hand, as I point out in this presentation, there's a large degree of precarity or precariousness. There's a large degree of instability, which can be quite terrifying, I think. And when I work with my students in the classroom at my university, I hear a lot of stories about climate crisis and depression and anxiety and worries about the future of the earth as a system, as a stable system, not just the future of my life or my career or my profession, but the entire picture of the world. And it reminds me a little bit of when I was younger and there was a threat, a constant threat of nuclear war. I mean, we have that maybe a little bit again now with Putin, but this constant threat of nuclear war was a condition that we all lived under, where there was a concern that at any moment the world might be exploded and destroyed. So there's a similar occurrence, but I feel that with the Anthropocene, there is also an understanding that we can have some impact on making better conditions. And that felt much less possible than during this time of nuclear threat, where it was really superpowers that made the decisions about whether we would go to war or not. In this Anthropocene age, which is likewise terrifying, we also can take action collectively through political movements, social movements, artistic practices, responding to people, speaking with people, sharing ideas that can make a difference. It can alleviate our anxiety on the one hand to a small degree, but it can also hopefully make some kind of change in the larger political, social, and cultural world that we occupy. So these are important questions. I think the other thing that comes to mind about Generation Anthropocene is that in some ways, there's a huge opportunity here. And by opportunity, I don't mean necessarily financial opportunity or opportunity to grow industry or the stock market or things like this. What I mean is an opportunity to make a civilizational change, an opportunity to create a new world. And there is not often this opportunity given to a generation. If we think back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, you had James Watt invented the steam engine, and all of a sudden industrialization began, and these systems of fossil fuel exploitation, these systems of energy came into use in Europe and then spread all over the world without really thinking about it, without a lot of concern about what it might do to the world or how it might have an impact. So that was the last big energy transition that we went through collectively in the world. We had the Industrial Revolution. That was the last energy transition that we faced. Now we are undergoing a different kind of energy transition toward renewable forms, toward solar power, toward wind power. Hydroelectric power is maybe not as green as it could be, biomass, tidal power. So we have these amazing capacities to transform the world's energy system. And the great thing about it is that now we have the consciousness and the capacity to see what we're doing. There's a real conscious address of the world energy system, a conscious desire to make a transformation for the better that didn't occur back in the 18th century. So I think that there is an opportunity here to create better conditions. And the question will be whether emotionally and affectively we can occupy that space, whether we can keep ourselves in the right spirit to be able to make the changes that we need to. And so that's why these questions are so important in the humanities, because the humanities has always understood how human beings engage with art and poetry and literature and culture and affect. And so from my point of view, the humanities are the space where we can really see this transformation happen. And to talk to people who understand philosophy and narrative and stories and the arts and the deep history of things is a way into understanding how we can shape a better future. There is an indigenous philosopher called Kyle Powys White. He's a North American indigenous guy, Anishinaabe, from the Anishinaabe people. And he has a lot of articles and publications that he has, but he has a great way of putting it, because he says, I find when I talk to white settler colonials that they get very upset about the Anthropocene. They're very worried. They're very anxious about the changing world, about these big impacts upon the environment and the changing world. And he said, from the point of view of indigenous people, our world has already been destroyed several times over. Our world, we were already displaced back during the beginnings of colonialism. Our people were already refugees of a kind, maybe not because of climate, but because of settler colonialism and imperialism. Our world has already been destroyed. And so what we're trying to do is we're not trying to save the world as it is, because the world as it is now is a world that's based on displacement and extraction and dispossession and violence, and the list goes on. We don't want to save that world. We want to create a different and better world. And I know that sounds very utopian or optimistic, but I think that his message is very important. It's not about saving the world that we have. Personally, I don't want to save the world of extractive capitalism. I don't want to save the world of racial capitalism. That's not what we need to preserve. We don't need to preserve that. What we need to preserve are our ecosystems, our environments for stability, and then find new social forms that can come with those better environments and those better worlds. And I think that the energy transitions that we're going through, the Anthropocene responses that we are implementing, these are opportunities to create new social forms. These are opportunities to create new kinds of relationships with one another. So if we can imagine it that way, I think we can imagine something better than what we have now.
Muito introspectivo, muito reflexiva essa resposta, professor. Eu acho que sim, nós, através das humanidades, nós conseguimos pelo menos arranhar a profundidade que é e a complexidade que é os estudos a partir desses gatilhos do antropoceno, desses detonadores do antropoceno, né? E o que isso causa não só na biosfera, mas também na tecnosfera, como a senhora falou sobre os sistemas de produção, de consumo, e também nas dimensões mais sutis, que é como nós estamos espiritualmente e emocionalmente engajados nesse novo desafio que nos é posto. E
Yes.
através desses elementos, gostaria de destacar um elemento muito interessante da apresentação é fazer uma conexão com o filósofo sul-coreano Byung-Chul Han, onde nos últimos estudos dele, ele busca centralizar os rituais do nosso cotidiano como uma chave, uma conexão profunda com a complexidade física e metafísica da realidade. Então, como seria esse desafio de ligar o peso e a importância dos rituais, por exemplo, os memoriais e funerais para as geleiras, como a senhora mostrou na apresentação, como ligar o peso e a importância desses rituais nas atividades econômicas e financeiras predatórias, em uma escala que possa, de fato, criar mudanças nos nossos sistemas de produção e de consumo. Como ligar essas dimensões físicas e metafísicas?
That's a great question. I'm not familiar with this philosopher, but I'd like to find his work. It sounds really, really interesting. So I wrote down his name. I'll find his work. I think this question about the physical and the metaphysical is fascinating. You know, as I was doing the work with the glacier, it was very interesting to see the transmutation between ideas of life and death, and living and non-living. And the sense that a piece of ice, a glacier, could be alive was an interesting sort of thought exercise for me. And I shared in the presentation how glaciologists speak about glaciers with terms that very much are about a lively being, the toes and the snouts and the tongues. And so in part because of that, and in part because in Icelandic, there's a gender to a glacier, and glaciers are gendered as male. So when I would speak to glaciologists about glaciers, they would call that glacier him. They'd say, he is no longer alive. He is dead ice. These are the terms that they use. And so I was invited to meditate, actually, and to think through this rather metaphysical question about what constitutes the living and what constitutes the non-living. One of the other definitions of whether a glacier is whether it moves across the land. And so a glacier must move in order to be alive. It must move in order not to be dead ice. That's the way glaciologists talk about it. So how do you sort of think through these things? Because glaciers are not alive in any conventional sense of the term. They are ice that moves because of gravity and because of weight down the mountain. They have these creature-like terms associated with them because of humans anthropomorphizing the glaciers. But what if we were to think of a glacier as a living thing? How would that be? Now, of course, you're thinking many indigenous populations do think of earth forms and earth beings as living things. And we see this throughout the Andes, for example, earth beings that are created, that are constituted in a mountain. A mountain has a spiritual force, a kind of a beingness to it. It has a personality. And many anthropologists and others have written about this. So there is a long history of these sentient beings that live on the earth. And there's been a really interesting movement in the legal community globally recently that you've probably been reading about. And that is the declaration of legal personhood to non-sentient forms. So for example, in the Himalayas, they have given personhood status, legal personhood, to 2 rivers that come from 2 glaciers. They've given personhood status to those glaciers. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, we see that they've given personhood status to a river, the Wanganui River. And the reason for doing this is, on the one hand, to protect the glacier and the rivers from capitalist extraction, and as you mentioned, right, these very destructive forms of extraction. But on the other hand, it does create a different sensibility about a river and a glacier or a forest. And so I think that there are very interesting phenomenon occurring in the world now. And this is the legal community, which is a very conservative group of people. For the most part, it tends to be a very conservative line of work. And yet they're thinking outside, some of them are thinking outside the box in terms of how to designate these changes. So I appreciate this question about what counts as life and what counts as non-living, and how we can sort of fuse those and bring those together. There's a very interesting work by an anthropologist called Elizabeth Pavanelli about geontologies. I don't know if you've seen that yet, but she talks about the kind of obsession within the human sciences, the social sciences and humanities for the last 300 years or so, about the distinction between life and death, that which is living and is now non-living, and how much of our conceptual world has been based around life and death. And her proposition is that in the Anthropocene, we need to focus on the living and the non-living, that which has never been alive. And that's a very different proposition between life and death, to asking questions between and about the living and the non-living, and how those two convene. Because of course we are ourselves comprised of non-living elements. We are stardust, as they like to say. So we have non-living geological form that creates our body in the form of carbon, in the form of water. So we are living beings that are made of the non-living world. And I think when we take that to heart, and when we expand that conceptualization out, we can begin to see the world and feel the world differently. If I walk around the world as a mineral, as a bag of water, how does that engage me differently with the world, rather than walking around as an individual cognitive human subject with an identity and a history and all of these things that we take for granted? So it's a wonderful question. I think it's a very provocative question.
E nós que temos que agradecer também nas respostas provocativas e muito reflexivas que a senhora está colocando. Eu acho que são elementos muito profundos, muito importantes, e de fato o antropoceno nos faz pensar assim, de forma onde a gente possa expandir as nossas categorias tradicionais do saber. E temos uma pergunta diretamente do YouTube, do H. Castilho. Vou ir direto para ela. Ele faz uma afirmação antes. Ele comenta: efetivamente houve agilidade na comunicação, mas a qualidade e responsabilidade sobre as informações não acompanhou esta proporção. E ele pergunta: como isto poderia influir diante das mudanças necessárias?
So the question is that that information about the Anthropocene has not kept up with the changes that are occurring. Is that correct?
Ele não especificou, mas acredito que seja sobre a questão da mudança climática, do novo regime climático do antropoceno, como no geral. Convidamos, inclusive, o Castilho para nos esclarecer esse ponto, se possível.
Should I wait a minute while he says something more, or?
Enquanto nós podemos passar para uma outra questão, que eu acho que ela também fala sobre os desafios da comunicação do novo regime climático para a sociedade como um todo. Então, depois voltamos para a pergunta do H. Castilho. Bom, essa pergunta também relaciona a outro filósofo, o filósofo francês Bruno Latour. Ela comenta: como as condições de habitabilidade, uma categoria que está sendo constantemente e ultimamente levantada por Bruno Latour, as condições de habitabilidade, pode se tornar o eixo de discussão em antropologia cultural e no seu diálogo transdisciplinar com outras áreas do saber, em especial as hard sciences, as ciências duras. Qual o poder, é uma outra questão dentro dessa, qual o poder da globalização hidrológica como um método de denúncia dos impactos do antropoceno? E, por fim, se a senhora poderia falar um pouco mais sobre a antropologia pública e como esse projeto está se desenvolvendo politicamente.
Great. Those are great questions. Well, Bruno Latour is a philosopher whose work I do know. So I don't need to look him up. Of course, he's been so influential in the question of the relationship between social science and natural science and how technology is conditioned by human capacities. And I think his work more recently on the Anthropocene and the different interactions of our worlds has been very, very important and influential. I'm also really drawn to the way that Bruno Latour makes the distinction between matters of critique, as he calls them, matters of critique, to matters of concern. And in a very interesting way, he critiques much of his earlier work through this argument, where he explains that the critical project of deconstruction, of recognizing that science is a constructed form of social making rather than an objective, naturalized physical form, was very, very important, that those matters of critique have been very important, but also that we need to now turn to matters of concern, that we need to turn to the objects of care and attention that are required. And so that pivot for me is really an important moment in his thought, where he goes from matters of critique to matters of concern, that which we should care about. And I think the work that he's been doing also with Isabelle Stengers is quite interesting. Her work on cosmopolitics. We're reading, Stengers has a pretty new book out where she makes an argument for slow science. She calls it a manifesto for slow science. And it's a wonderful commentary. We've been reading it in my seminar this semester. And in this book, she makes the argument that science and the production of articles, of books, of scientific publications has accelerated and ballooned over time, but that actually we're finding less and less that is of concern, right? Less and less material forms that we need to address. And so she makes an argument for slowing down the production of science because science itself has become this neoliberal machine of production where we're constantly needing to publish and publish and publish, and yet the quality of that material may be going down. And she's talking primarily about the natural sciences, but that's very worrisome. And her point is that if scientists cannot slow down their productivity and turn to the big questions that we need to attend to, then we are all collectively in trouble. And some of this also relates to the kind of attention gap that many people in the popular media have been writing about, our constant attention on social media, our constant attention to screens, our constant distraction all day long, all night long, this constant distraction actually prevents us from thinking long and deep about the issues that we need to engage. That our collective distraction, this distraction that we're all experiencing all the time, is actually keeping us collectively from responding to the Anthropocene in the ways that we need to, because we need to have a sustained attention. We need to have sustained thought and action around this. And yet we're constantly, all of us constantly distracted. So the question of hydrological globalization as method. I mean, it's a new method, and I'm really trying it out now. So I've just begun this project. I've done the melt project, but now I'm doing the melt rise project, and so it's still new. I've done the work in Iceland, and in the summer I spent time in Honolulu talking to people about sea level rise. And I'm finding a lot of comparative resonance. So there's a lot of comparative practices that people are engaging. Some of it has to do with policy, some of it has to do with infrastructure, a lot of it has to do with politics and the politics of a place. But the plan for it is to try and compare these responses, to these adaptation responses across these different sites, to understand how people might be doing similar things or very different things in very, very different places. These places are not connected to each other really in any other way. But, you know, between Cape Town and Iceland, there's no social connectivity. There's no colonial history. There's no linguistic history. There's no exchange of media. There's no major financial flows. There's no migration or immigration. There's very little trade, if any. So there's very little connection otherwise. And yet these two places at the opposite ends of the world are connected through their water. And so I find this very, very interesting. And my hope is at the end of this project, in about 2 years, to be able to create a project, a public project. This is coming back to public anthropology also, to create a public facing project that I'm calling Sister Cities for the Anthropocene. So we know the Sister Cities program, where you have cities all over the world that are sort of symbolically connected to each other, but they recognize each other because of political histories or shared size, location in their respective countries. So what this project would do, it would draw attention between these distant places. So Sister Cities of the Anthropocene is a project that I hope to be able to do, and maybe it will take a physical form of some kind of built installation. Could be an installation. It could be something that just exists on the internet. But the idea would be to draw attention to the relationship between these between two places, but more overall. I think that.
Muito obrigado, e desde já desejamos sucesso nesse novo projeto. Espero que podemos ter outra conversa, uma outra conferência falando um pouco mais sobre esse projeto. E nós recebemos a confirmação do Castilho, que fez a pergunta anterior. Eu vou refazer a pergunta, e sim, a agilidade na comunicação que ele fala é de fato a comunicação sobre o antropoceno, sobre o novo regime climático. Então eu vou refazer a pergunta. Ele comenta que efetivamente houve agilidade na comunicação destes assuntos sobre o clima, mas a qualidade e a responsabilidade sobre estas informações não acompanhou a proporção da sua agilidade. E ele pergunta como isto poderia influir diante das mudanças necessárias. Aproveito já para falar que nosso tempo está chegando ao fim, então essa vai ser a última pergunta, e depois abrimos um espaço para as considerações finais da senhora. Fique à vontade.
Great. Well, that is a really important question, because I think what's being stated here is that while we do have much communication about the Anthropocene, it's not very effective. And I think part of the problem has been that our sole focus, or the sole focus of the media, really has been around the science. And the science is very, very important. I don't want to say that the physical science, the natural science is not important. Of course it is. And scientists have been heroes in many ways, out there explaining their findings, explaining the threats, writing these IPCC reports very regularly, and trying to communicate the the magnitude of the problem and the dangers of the situation. So I think scientists have been quite heroic. And here in the United States, some of them have been threatened with death and their families threatened. So it's a rather frightening situation all around. But, and again, this is where I think the humanities really come in, is that the scientists haven't quite been able to tell the story that needs to be told. And I think the story is not one story, it's many stories. It's many stories based on many small things, many stories based on larger events and phenomenon, but the stories are critically important. And Catherine McKittrick, who's a really important scholar in Black studies, has written a whole book called Dear Science. And she really talks about the importance of stories. And I agree with her on that having our stories out there is one of the fundamental pieces that we still need to address. So we need to keep the science, and we need to recognize the science, but we also need to recognize that it will take more than science to change our habits and to change our policies, because we are in fact a species that tells stories. Human beings are we're a storied animal. We need narrative, we use words, that's one of our special capacities. And so we need to use our words in that way too, not just to talk about the quantitative statistics, but to tell the important narratives as well. And sometimes those are stories about loss, but they're also stories about what we can save and what we can preserve and what we can do. So keeping optimism is also important. So great. So I thank you all for your questions. They were very, very insightful and provocative, and I've taken notes, and it's actually been quite inspiring to hear your ideas and thoughts and to be able to spend this time with you. So I want to thank Unisinos once again and the Humanities Institute for the invitation. It was just a lovely engagement, and I'm glad that we were able to do it. And I have to respect the technology that allowed us to do it. So as much as I might complain about some technology, I think for the most part, Zoom has and other digital technologies have really brought us through the pandemic in so many ways, and also facilitated this kind of capacity to be able to talk to one another from the other side of well, at least we're in the same hemisphere, from the other side of the equator.